Hamas is driven by an idea. They have not given up on that idea. That's the destruction of Israel because of their Islamic totalitarian vision. They have not given that up.
Even like alleged victims, if you were actually concerned with them, you would be concerned with, like, how do they live even like in semi-freedom, free from Hamas and being terrorized by this? There's no concern about that. The whole thing is to just heap scorn and scrutiny on Israel.
In the last 72 hours, Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire, and the 20 Israeli hostages who are still alive returned home. The remains of the dead are next. As part of this deal, nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners have been released. Donald Trump has hailed this as the historic dawn of a new Middle East. I agree it is historic, but what is the meaning of this peace deal? Is it what justice demands? I'm joined today by my colleague Onkar Ghate. Onkar, I wanted to get your reaction to this deal and how you think about this.
My basic reaction is this is probably close to the best that you could ask for in the current context, given the whole reaction of the Western world after October 7th. And I think we have to come back and talk about that. So in other words, I think it's good given the context, but that's such a low bar that in the end, it's not something that should be celebrated. It's a kind of ceasefire, but the side that needed to be defeated and defeated, and it recognizing its defeat, and the Western world, led by Israel and America, demanding its defeat. That's what had to happen. That's what this deal is so much not about. That you can be glad that there's a ceasefire, but you can't think long term that this is what was necessary and needed after October 7th. Well, that was your overall reaction.
Yeah, my reaction is similar, but maybe more emphasizing the negatives, because I what this brought to mind for me, not in every detail, but just in a core feature of it, is the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. So clearly, Israel isn't retreating in a ignominious way from Gaza. It has accomplished significant gains, but one feature is in common that I think is significant, which is this is not really evidence of Israel accomplishing its stated goal at the outset, which was to totally defeat Hamas, that's the goal I was in favor of. I wrote an op-ed at the time, shortly after October 7th, that's a necessary condition for a future peace in the Middle East. And that's a thrust of the book, What Justice Demands, which I brought out in 2018. And we heard Israeli leaders and many people in Israel say, total victory, that's what we need. That is not what's happened. Hamas, it's true, has been severely degraded. Most of their leaders have gone. It doesn't have the capabilities to launch attacks, all of which those are positives or the significant reductions of negatives. And that's something to look at and look at favorably, for sure, because it means the security for people living in Israel is much improved. But it's important to see that Hamas doesn't see itself as defeated. It's back on the streets, asserting police power. And just the other day, a viral video that Hamas deliberately released, this is not a whistleblower video. Hamas took 8 people in the streets, blindfolded, and executed them in the street as a show of force. And of course, Hamas has been showing itself as the de facto ruler of Gaza. It has not given up its weapons, and there's no reason to think it will, despite the terms of this agreement. So Hamas is still around. And this might seem like some people might view this and say, well, that's nitpicking. They're already defeated. They're not going to be able to do it on October 7th anytime soon. Well, all of which is true. But the crucial piece that's overlooked is that Hamas is driven by an idea. They have not given up on that idea. That's the destruction of Israel because of their Islamic totalitarian vision. They have not given that up. And Islamists, we know, not only in Gaza, but in other parts of the world, they think long range. The plans for October 7th did not happen the week before. They were many years in the making. And even Hamas's own strategy is generations long. The same is true of other forces. So there's every reason to think that down the road, unless they're fully defeated and give up their goals, there will be more aggression from Hamas because they still regard their goal as viable. And there's a winking agreement to this from the US and other powers that Hamas is going to have to do stay in power, at least for the time being, in Gaza. So to me, that's a far from a victory, far from the kind of thing that people are celebrating. Even as I'm happy for the people whose families are seeing hostages return. That's definitely something important, and the elimination of a profound injustice. But the idea that with Hamas still, the vestiges of Hamas still around, that is how we should see victory, that is a gross defining down of success. And unfortunately, this is a pattern in Western fighting against the Islamists. We saw that in Afghanistan, we saw that in Iraq. We see it here again over and over.
I find it shocking that after September 11th and then after October 7th, people still cannot take seriously that what their goal is. They'll tell you over and over that this is their goal. They'll take action towards their goal, that it's that what they want isn't, as you said, Islamic totalitarianism. They want to wipe out Israel. And if October 7th doesn't convince you that this is something that you can't live with, that this is unlivable, and it requires the complete defeat and the demoralization of the cause, it's hard to imagine what would. So that's why in the context of we no longer pursue victory, I think what you've seen after October 7th is a severe downgrading, like a severe downgrading of their military capabilities. And it's not just Hamas, it's Hezbollah, and it's more widely Iran. And that's an enormous positive, and it's security in the short and maybe even medium term. But long term, if they're still pursuing that goal and they're recognized as legitimate or semi-legitimate players politically and in the region, you can't expect peace long term in the region.
Yeah, you mentioned at the beginning the Western reaction to October 7th, and part of what you're raising, I think, connects to that. I want to emphasize something in the Western reaction to this, which is the way that we're now seeing the assumption that, well, there's a peace plan on the table, there's backing for it from regional powers, and yes, there's hard work ahead, but it's in the absence of recognizing what Hamas is really about, and the idea that you can overlook its ideological character, and that it's been for decades now indoctrinating generation after generation of people in Gaza. And the idea that, well, all those people, yes, they've suffered significant hardship now in the war, and they've lost homes, but they haven't given up. Hamas hasn't given up on its goal, and the people who they've indoctrinated have not done the same. And here I would point to the reactions of people in Gaza and other places to, and particularly in the West Bank, where there's significant support for Hamas, to the return of the Palestinian prisoners. More than 2,000 of them, 250 of them serving life sentences for terror-related convictions. They're welcomed home as heroes, and that is really disturbing. And it's not surprising, but that you kind of overlook that and think, well, there's a chance here for people to abandon the views they've held for so long and that they've supported for so long, the kinds of people they lionize as heroes. You can't overlook all of that and think, well, now we have a peace plan and it's on the table. There are features of the peace plan that are worth noting, but I think that the widest context is the ignoring of what the ideas are that people are animated by, and to think if you leave them undefeated and clinging to those ideas, that you will get something better in the future. I think that's just ludicrous.
There's a way in which I think of the Western world has abandoned, particularly in the Middle East, has abandoned even the pretense of being concerned with freedom. And this is part of the tragic and destructive aftermath of 9/11, that the Bush administration pursued what they called a forward strategy of freedom. And they had no idea either what freedom really meant. It meant just like elections. And it's part of how Hamas came into power. Well, we have to bring elections throughout this region. And they were explicitly asked, well, what happens if they vote for terrorists and killers? Well, democracy's democracy was the kind of reply, which meant that an equation of what freedom means is the ability to vote, including the ability to vote for killers. And it was this strategy that's supposedly what it looks like to be on the side of freedom. And well, that was a nightmare that did not work. So maybe what one needs to do is abandon concern with freedom. And it's so that it's, oh, maybe we can work something out with Hamas. And if they demilitarize and promise not to build more tunnels, maybe we can do something. But I think more broadly, the players in the Middle East, it's maybe we can get Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia to participate and send peacekeepers into here. And that's, there's a way in which you can say that something like Egypt is better than Hamas. It's not a complete totalitarian society, but it's not a free society either. And to abandon the idea that that should be the goal, and that if you have any respect for any individuals in that region outside of Israel, it's the respect should be if they want to work to build a free society, we would be on the side of that. And now that it has been abandoned, and maybe you can get some kind of thing that is relatively peaceful in the way that the Egypt and Israel are now not at war anymore. But that's not the any longer championing the ideal of a free society. And that thinking of it in those terms is part of what I find depressing about the whole thing, that's been abandoned.
Now, a couple of further points I wanted to raise in connection to this. At the beginning, I raised the question, is this what justice demands? And that connects to the topic of the book I wrote a few years ago. I think this deal is in so many ways an inversion of justice for some of the reasons we mentioned, which is leaving Hamas undefeated, I think is unjust to its victims, unjust to the Palestinians who don't want to live under Hamas, and who are, at least for the time being and for the foreseeable future, going to remain under Hamas power, which is brutal. And I think the absence of an outcry about the return of its daily brutality, I think, is horrifying commentary on people in the West who were complaining about Israeli conduct both before and after the war. So that it's unjust to the victims, and it's empowering of the worst elements. Like, it's telling them, yes, you might have voted for Hamas, you might have served as human shields for them, but don't worry, full aid is on the way. That's a condition of this agreement, that aid will immediately return to Gaza, and that all the reconstruction, because there's going to be billions of dollars of reconstruction necessary to rebuild what's left of Gaza, all of that, according to the agreement, is for the benefit of the people of Gaza. Which people? The people who were chanting and supporting Hamas, who breached the fence and joined in the atrocities of October 7th, or the actual few, who, however many there are, who are not interested in living under Hamas and are not interested in those atrocities. So there's a whitewashing of the people of Gaza, who are, I think, in many cases complicit, and worse than complicit, in the attacks of Hamas, not just on October 7th, since then and before then. And none of that is being taken seriously. And I think you can't look at the resolution of a conflict like this and pretend, yeah, it doesn't matter. We don't care that all these tunnels open up in private homes with people winking and helping and supporting them. All these weapons have been hidden in private homes, and all these people know it, and we're part of it. And now we're glossing over all of that. I'll say one other thing which I find objectionable out of many things that are objectionable here, which is that, and I think this is not a surprise, but it's a punctuation mark, an exclamation point on just the complete detachment of this issue from any real moral thinking. So the climax of the 20-point plan that Trump put forward, which is the basis for the ceasefire. There's other things to say about this agreement, but it climaxes with the understanding that in the end, this will open a path to Palestinian self-determination and statehood, and to recognize this as the aspiration of the Palestinian people. The other day, my colleague Nikos and I were on a podcast talking about the UK and French endorsement or recognition of a Palestinian state. And I think that this is a feature of this agreement, it just compounds the injustice. I've said both in the book and the podcast in many places and for years now that it's wrong to think that everyone who wishes for a state deserves one. It's wrong to think that those who wish for a dictatorial or tyrannical or religious theocracy state deserve one. It's quite the opposite, that the principle that governs that question is the moral issue of freedom. And do you support freedom? Is that what you're trying to gain more of in pursuit of a state? And that's there's no way to look at the history of the Palestinian movement in all of its forms, religious and nationalist, and think that freedom is really what they're after. So this is a further whitewashing. Whitewashing is probably too soft a term for this, of what the Palestinian movement has been about for all of its history. And now, especially in the aftermath of October 7th and this devastating war, the idea that that would be capping off the ceasefire deal, which is supposed to lay a path for freedom, for peace, I think it's an affront. It's an affront to anyone who really values their life and values the idea of free societies, which are the only means of getting to the kind of economic prosperity that people have been talking about as a possibility for the Palestinian society for decades, which has been a possibility squandered over and over.
Yeah, I think that's the widest context in which the whole deal has to be looked at. And it's why that you couldn't have anything positive long-term if October 7th didn't convince any thinking person in the Western world that whatever happens, these people cannot have a state. That is, they cannot be governing, that it will be mass terror and mass death if they have power. And the more power they have, the more death there will be. And giving them a state is the greatest acknowledgement of, yeah, they should be wielding power. And what you just see in the days after the ceasefire, of them now targeting Palestinians, collaborators, factions that they're worried might get too much power and challenge them. That's what they've been doing from inception of when they gained power. It's what they promised to do. It's what they say they will do. And it's what they say they want to do to Israel. And as they demonstrated when they get an opportunity, that was the attack of October 7th, they'll carry it out to whatever degree they're capable. And the idea that the world's reaction to that would be, yeah, maybe we should revive a two-state solution. Like, maybe that's what we need to do. It's such a travesty of justice that if that view is taken seriously, you can't have a good outcome. It's hard. I mean, you can't project, if October 7th didn't discredit them as the idea that, oh, maybe they should wield political power and we should view them as a political entity, like a viable political entity. If that didn't discredit them, what could? And I think the answer is nothing. Nothing could. And that is, it is not just the appeasement of evil, but the embrace of evil. As, yeah, we've seen it. and it doesn't matter to us.
And just to build on that, so you're characterizing as the embrace of evil, and I want to develop this theme of the injustice of it, because at the same time that there is, I agree with you, an embrace of evil and an endorsing of it, there is the cutting down of the victim here, the innocent victim, in my opinion, which is Israel. Despite all the criticisms I've had of Israel for many years, and which constitute a significant part of my analysis in the book, What Justice Demands, I'm very critical of Israel for important moral reasons. And yet I think it is the victim in this conflict, and it is on the side of the good, insofar as it has and tries to live up to the principle of freedom politically. Here's the flip side of what you're saying, which is the embrace of evil in thinking about allowing Palestinians, and particularly Hamas or whoever succeeds them, in having a state. The flip side is partly expressed in the European response, which I don't think got significant attention, but it's really telling. So there was an article in Politico just the other day in the shadow of this ceasefire deal, where a number of European diplomatic figures who all spoke on condition of anonymity because they're so brave and this is their position, their point was the deal's on the table and it's inked. It's now on Israel to deliver. And unless it delivers, and they mean aid and support for the Palestinians, unless it delivers, they will carry forward their threats to impose sanctions and other kinds of penalties on Israel. And this is, it's basically saying that Israel needs to support its enemies. Israel needs to enable them. It needs to give them aid and support and food and nourish them, despite everything that's happened, despite all the evidence that they're undeserving, and that it bears responsibility for the fate of the Palestinians, not Hamas. In the article, not once does it mention Hamas's culpability for everything that's happened since October 7th. And I think this is typical of a particular way of thinking about moral issues. And I think Ayn Rand's term for this was altruism. It's a particular philosophical position. It's nothing to do with being nice to people or benevolent toward them or friendly or even supportive. It means the demand for sacrifice. And the only way in which a sacrifice can actually happen is the surrender of something more valuable to something less valuable or not valuable. I think this is exactly what the embrace of evil and the cutting down of the good really looks like. This is the full expression of what altruism looks like. It's a difficult thing for people to process and really believe that this is where it leads to, but this is what it leads to. And I think this is one of the insights that Ayn Rand brings to morality that unlocks so much of what's incomprehensible in our world today. And I think this is the inversion of justice, the core of this conflict, and it has been for a long time. It didn't start with October 7th. October 7th put it in spotlight for people in a way that nothing else had done so before.
And notice there's not even a pretense anymore of being concerned with freedom. So if you draw the contrast to Ukraine, Zelensky, and Putin, the Europeans at least have some hand waving and some kind of middling action towards, yeah, we support the freer society. We're against a tyrant, an autocrat, someone who wants to invade. Now, there's not that much point of going to degrees of evil, but if you have Hamas or Putin and you had to pick, I would pick Hamas as the more evil of the two. They're both, the depth of evil here is so considerable that it's sort of hair splitty. But if you had to do it, I would pick Hamas as more evil. And Israel's better than Ukraine. So Israel's a freer society than is Ukraine. And Hamas is a worse evil than is Putin. And the fact that the Europeans, but more broadly, like there's a lot of sympathy in North America for this kind of viewpoint as well, of viewing Israel as the problem and Hamas as, we're not going to say anything, we're not going to investigate much about, like, how did October 7th, how did that become possible? Not just sort of the attack, but the support it has, as you were saying, when these people are released from the Israeli prisons and go back, they're championed. Like, how is that possible? How do you have a whole culture like this? There's so little interest in trying to investigate that and understand that the whole, and this is part of what Ayn Rand said about altruism, the idea that when it's motivated by is even like alleged victims and we're trying to do something about for them, aid is it'll be for weeks or so on. If you were actually concerned with them, you would be concerned with, like, how do they live even like in semi-freedom, free from Hamas and being terrorized by this? There's no concern about that. The whole thing is to just heap scorn and scrutiny on Israel. I was watching the BBC. Now, they're one of the worst in this conflict, but I was watching it after the ceasefire and this agreement. And the whole thing was, is Israel going to live up to the, and that's the real target, that Israel's the target. And that tells you something depressing, but tells you something that you should not turn away from, that it's not motivated by concern for suffering. It's motivated by hatred for something good. And it's like, that's what we need to attack and tear down. And more broadly, that's what you saw in North America. That's what most of the protests are on college campuses and not. They're all aimed at Israel, and they're unconcerned with Hamas. And that's why it's not like even a whitewash. It's like, we don't have to be concerned with what they do, because what we're trying to do is tear down Israel. And it's such a profound antithesis of what morality demands and what justice demands.
I want to wrap up with one further thought here, which goes to the kind of question that I was giving lots of talks after October 7th to various audiences, and we did lots of podcasts. And one of the questions that kept coming up is, okay, so what happens the day after? So let's say your goal of defeating the goal that I advocated for as a necessary condition of resolving the conflict is defeat Hamas, defeat the Palestinian cause. So the question that came up was, what happens the day after? What's your plan for the day after? Now, I talk about this in some detail in the book, What Justice Demands, but the question isn't really the one we should be asking, because we haven't reached the day after. We've, as you put it earlier, we degraded the capabilities of Israel's enemies, especially Hezbollah and Iran, but Hamas, especially in the Gaza Strip. So it's a question of, yes, it's less threatening. That's a good outcome, but it's not really the day after. It hasn't been defeated. And I think I just want to put on the table that the standard for success here is much higher than people are willing to admit. It really means defeating an enemy. And in the Q&As that I did after these various talks, people were dumbfounded that such a thing is possible. And I bring up historical examples of Japan after World War II and even Germany after World War II and still other cases. And when people hear that this is possible, it helps them understand what the path forward looks like. And the way I summarize this, the essential step is it's educational. People have to learn to abandon irrational ideas that have been driving them, the Islamic totalitarian vision and the endorsement of it, the complicity with it. They need to abandon that as destructive to them, destructive to life, and adopt better ideas. And you can think of that as an educational goal. It's to dislodge a certain irrational idea in their minds and push them towards better ideas that are supportive of human life, freedom, and economic trade. And there's so much else to say here. And I just want to acknowledge that the closest I've seen any of the political statements on this come to this, I think you have to squint to see this. We were talking about this before we started recording. In the peace plan, there's a 20-point peace plan from the Trump administration. It has two things in it that I think of as distant echoes of what would be needed here, which is to dislodge and defeat the ideas and have people abandon their ideas. The first one is that the Gaza Strip needs to be, quote, de-radicalized, which I think is putting it mildly, but it would be a good thing if you can manage that. And the other piece of it is it's difficult for me to speak of it with a straight face because I find it ridiculous on its face. But there's something here, as we were talking earlier, Onkar, that there's something right-headed about this. So point 18 is about an interfaith dialogue to establish that the values of tolerance and peaceful coexistence, I'm paraphrasing parts of this, to change mindsets and narratives of Palestinians and Israelis by emphasizing the benefits that can be derived from peace. Some of that sounds like new agey stuff and the kind of cliches you hear around the discussions of the peace process for many years. So some of that could just be those cliches resurfacing. But the idea of changing mindsets, insofar as it means the kind of thing that I have in mind, and the idea of changing narratives, that's critical. That's more of that, and taking that really seriously, I think, is a necessary feature of any step towards a resolution that brings out a good outcome. So I don't know that this will be acted on, and I don't want to overemphasize this feature of what's in the plan. But that is one thing that deserves special emphasis, because it's so surprising in its inclusion. We haven't seen it. I haven't seen something this serious, as unserious as it is, in past discussions. So to me, I bring that up because it's to emphasize how I think of what the solution needs to look like. And there's crumbs here that suggest a better direction.
Yeah. But it's hard to imagine anything taking hold absent the idea that they've been defeated and that this cause has been discredited. Because part of the education that you're emphasizing is you're not going to convince, and you shouldn't even try to convince, the loyal Hamas followers and soldiers. So they have to be defeated, and many of them have been killed. And they have to be marginalized. So you have to think of it as society-wide, that the cause is being seen as defeated. Those who are on it, it's a liability, that is, who still support the cause. It's a liability. It's a liability culturally and especially politically. But like, you can't get into power. You can't seize the machinery of governance if that's what you think. Like, that's what had to happen in Japan. That's what had to happen in Germany, so that the better people, or sort of the more middle of the road people, it's, if I go down that road, that lends to my defeat. And if I go in a somewhat better path, that might be a better path. And it's that at the margins that you're trying to do. And that doesn't happen if it's you haven't defeated them. So that's why it's very ominous that right when the ceasefire, the supposed collaborators and so on, that's who the Hamas is going after. There's a reason they're going after that. It's anybody who thought, and they would have rightly thought, yeah, of these two sides, Israel's the better side. You're collaborating with the better side, and that they're targeting them. That's what it looks like when they're not defeated, and that this cause has not been hasn't been shown to be a lost cause, and that it's a disaster if that hasn't happened. So the education is not like of an individual. You have to think of it as society-wide, what has to happen and what could happen and what will happen if they're not defeated.
I think with that, we should draw a line, and I'm sure there'll be more to say about the developments coming out of the Gaza agreement. Thanks today, Onkar.